Welcome to My Favorite Mystic, a podcast about the weird and wonderful world of mysticism. I'm AJ Langley, and today I'm joined by Joel Hecker. He is professor of Jewish mysticism at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia. Joel, thanks for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
So we have a little bit of a different episode today, because instead of looking at a particular mystic, we are going to look at a particular mystical text.
That's right. And part of the reason for that is that even though this text, which is called the Zohar, is the most influential text in Jewish mysticism, its authorship remains shadowed and veiled under the mystique of history and the mode of its transmission. It was revealed in the early 1290s by a Rabbi Moshe de Leon, who was a prolific Kabbalist on his own, who lived in Castile. And he claimed that the pamphlets that he was distributing were parts of a text that had been transmitted to him from the 2nd century from a Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, one of the rabbis of the Mishnah and Talmud. And though there's a great deal of similarity between Moshe de Leon's works, the 13th century Kabbalists, and the Zohar, his works lack some of the charm, the narrative, the exciting exegesis that we find in the Zohar.
Incredible. That is so much to think about just off the bat. But we're going to backtrack, and before we get too deep into this text, tell us a little bit more about you. How did you get interested in mysticism as a field of study?
So at the risk of sounding overly sensationalistic and provocative, it was at least partly because of the sex.
Of course it was. Of course it was. How obvious. No, seriously, explain yourself.
I was a young man, a rabbinical student, studying in a yeshiva and a rabbinical academy. The year was 1987-88. I was taking a year in Israel in addition to my years in New York. And I was studying two different things. I was working on a master's in Jewish philosophy, and in Jewish philosophy, particularly in the works of Maimonides, the great 12th century philosopher. I was reading about a God who was austere, removed, unreachable, and that God, while grand in its own way, was rather unlovable. The commandments that God offered were historically contingent and were there primarily as a way of ordering society. That was on the one hand. And on the other hand, in rabbinical school, I was in the depths of studying the laws of keeping kosher. And while those laws were intellectually interesting in their own way and even have a certain kind of fascination, they were not deeply spiritual. And all of a sudden, a friend started to feed me works of scholarship about Jewish mysticism. And all of a sudden, I was reading about a divinity with male and female moving parts. It was a divinity upon whom we could have an impact. It was a divinity that maintained continuity with mythical aspects of the biblical God, that God's love, anger, power. But at the same time, it showed a concern for the philosophically sophisticated readers of 13th century Spain.
It really feels like that explanation just moved firmly away from sex and back into something that's totally legitimate and academic. But obviously that's not how you were thinking about it at the time.
So here I was a single guy, and there's this God and there's male and female stuff going on, and well, woohoo, And this was rabbinical school sublimation at its best.
Perfect. That's exactly as provocative as I was hoping it would be. But I agree with you. It is really interesting to see the way that sex and sensuality comes out in these discussions of mystical experiences, particularly in cases where we might assume that things like sex and sensuality are frowned upon or disapproved of. To see them used as one of the ways of knowing and understanding God is really interesting.
Right. So one of the interesting things about Jewish mysticism in contrast to Christian mysticism is that traditional Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, values marriage. It regards marriage as a commandment. It regards procreation as a commandment. And so the mystics in the medieval tradition are caught in this tension between, on the one hand, wanting to be intoxicated with God and to live pious, austere, and rather ascetic lifestyles, and yet at the same time are obligated by their religious commitments to marry and to have sex at least on a weekly basis. So on the one hand, there is experience here to be sure. And on the other hand, there is often a tension or disdain for the physical. And then rising out of that, as Carolyn Walker Bynum showed 30 years ago, there are different strategies for dealing with this drama or this tension between the spiritual and the physical, and that there's either a desire to lift up the physical or to drive the spiritual through the physical in ways that find the spiritual within the physical itself. And, very interestingly is already going back to St. Augustine and then continuing through the medieval Christian tradition regarding Judaism, there's a way in which Judaism somewhat celebrated its carnality, even as it wrestled with the Christian critique and polemicized against it as well.
That's a really fascinating difference between the two traditions. And obviously within the context of the expectations of marriage, sex, procreation, it makes sense that it would find its way into mysticism as well and be a prominent feature. So let's return now to the Zohar. We don't have a mystic to talk about today. Is that because the text is written by more than one person, or because we don't really know who wrote it? What kind of text is this, and what do we know about it?
There's been an evolution of thinking in scholarship about the authorship of the text. So while I said before that Moshe de Leon, who started to reveal bits or scrolls of this text in the 1290s, said, well, this is an ancient text. And people started to ascribe it to this second century Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who is the hero of the text. There are influences of what appear to be a circle that helped to create this text. We don't know what happened. It's not like Moshe de Leon was the head of the editorial board and they would have weekly meetings at which they would supply their submissions and he would go through and send it to copy editors and such like. But he does appear to have probably written a great deal of it and or redacted a great deal of it. Other figures are Joseph Chikatilia, who is a fellow traveler in Castile and who writes in slightly more philosophically oriented Kabbalistic texts. Figures like Joseph of Hamadan, who's writing late 13th, early 14th century Castile. Joseph of Hamadan is an interesting character. Hamadan is a town in Persia, and yet we know nothing about him. And he certainly seems to be living in Spain. He's writing in a Spanish style. A figure like David ben Yehuda HaChassid is also a early 14th century Castilian figure. Yosef ben Shalom Ashkenazi, yet another one. But that circle is influenced by other circles that are writing slightly earlier in Castile. People like the Cohen brothers. No, not that Cohen brothers. A different set of Cohen brothers, Jacob and Yitzchak Cohen. Although, like Joel Cohen with his recent version of Macbeth, they were also interested in the topic of evil and the way in which evil plays a role in describing divinity. And one other group that's highly influential is that there is a group in Barcelona, or if not exactly a group, sort of a cluster of Kabbalists, of Jewish mystics, operating in the mid to late 1200s. And they've got their own style. So this is a text that starts to come together, and then our earliest manuscript that we have is from the early 1400s. So we have 100 years of blank space, 100 years in which we don't know who did what to these texts. And we know very little about through whose hands they might have been transmitted. But when we look at the manuscripts today, while there are many variations, for the most part, the variants are relatively insubstantial. I've spent a lot of time with those manuscripts, and sometimes there are interesting variants. But certainly by the beginning of the 1500s, there's a certain amount of stability to what becomes a text of several thousand pages.
That is a lot, especially combining so many different influences. And I suppose that's another question. Is there an overarching unifying theme or set of themes? What pulls it all together into a single text?
Yeah, that's an important question. Among the important driving forces and impetuses for the creation and development of this text are promoting a mystical relationship and an esoteric relationship to the rabbinic tradition. And so a great deal of attention is paid to providing mystical rationales for the commandments. Why you sit in a booth during the holiday of Sukkot, why you eat unleavened bread during the festival of Passover, what the various rituals associated with the Sabbath are about, and the ways in which those can both lead to a unification of the Godhead, unification of divinity between masculine and feminine polarities, between upper and lower axes, between right and left, harmonization of good and evil, of grace and rigor. That's on the one hand. So in other words, there's a kind of an apologetic tendency, a desire to make Jewish practice more appealing on a certain level, not from a populist impulse so much as from a conviction that if the Torah, if the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible is not just from God, but is actually of God, that in some ways is a manifestation of divinity, of God's own being, perhaps even God's own body, then any interaction with the Torah, with the Hebrew Bible and its commandments is going to have a direct impact on the individual's relationship with God, ultimately leading to unification and mystical union with divinity. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, another major theme is the depiction of divinity as a Godhead with 10 different aspects. And while Judaism is very proud of its monotheism, the 10-fold gradations called sephirot that appear in Kabbalah are used to describe the relationship between transcendence and immanence, and love and judgment, and masculine and feminine. So that what you find throughout the Kabbalistic tradition is a use of those different gradations as keys or as a code for reading, providing esoteric readings of the Bible and of the rabbinic tradition, both of the Talmud and of its practices.
So what does mysticism and this mystical connection mean in the case of this text? What is it trying to establish? Is it about a personal relationship with the divine? Is it about a deeper understanding? What's the goal of mysticism here?
Right. So yes and yes, and yes to the other unasked questions. Different texts and different Kabbalistic figures of this time are going to emphasize different things. Some are going to be emphasizing a noetic approach, a more cognitive and more intellectualistic union of the human mind with divinity. But again, because of the emphasis on the traditional commandments, more often than not, it's going to be achieved through behavior that is linked with those understandings that ultimately will result in either mystical cleaving to God and or a bridging of perceived divisions within God. So the drive then is to bring about a harmony within the way in which divinity is manifest in the world, and perhaps even the way in which divinity is in and of itself existing.
That is so interesting, because I think sometimes we hear about this dichotomy between the bodily and the spiritual, and the idea that the human is limited, and therefore this connection with the divine is always going to involve a moving past one's body, a rejection of one's body. But a person's body and physical being is essential to their understanding and interacting with the world and their faith, and therefore also needs to have a role in this connection with the divine.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. My first book, based on my dissertation, was about mystical eating experiences and mystical eating practices. I was looking at the way in which ritual commandments involving food, such as the bread that one consumes on the Sabbath, the unleavened bread, the bitter herbs that one eats on Passover, and other festival foods, because they are perceived as being media of living contact with divinity, I made the argument that one could experience within one's own body, within one's own gut, as it were, a connection to divinity. There's a verse in Deuteronomy that says, "You shall eat and be satiated and bless the Lord your God." And because the rabbinic tradition interprets that to mean that you recite a blessing, grace after meals, after really a pretty minimal amount of bread, the Kabbalists look at this and they say, well, wait a second. The verse says you've got to be satiated. And so what they talk about is a certain kind of mystical satiation that ensues when one eats bread with the consciousness that it is from God's own mouth, that there's a certain kind of spiritual ecosystem in which God speaks the world into being, and thus the world in some way contains sparks of divinity that are then consumed by the human individual. And then when one feels a certain kind of bodily satiation, one sends that spiritual response back up in the form of blessings. So there's a kind of culinary and liturgical cycle that's engendered. So on the one hand, I've argued that there's an embodied quality to this mysticism, And yet, by the same token, there are other passages that argue for the more important practices of prayer or of contemplation, or that are much more highly abstract, and so that it becomes much more about the intellect. And very often you'll find that these two approaches are almost cheek by jowl, that you'll have a passage that emphasizes the physical right next to one that emphasizes the spiritual. And so much so that it'll talk about circumcision as a central feature of the definition of correspondence between the male mystic and divinity. I mean, imagine that. God's own self is circumcised because, after all, for the mystics, if the human being is created in the image of God and they are men writing for a male audience and they are writing about texts that are primarily oriented towards male practitioners, then it is through the coarsest physical part of the body and what is often derided by mystics as the crassest part of human existence, that it is going to be through that there is going to be a possibility of vision of divinity itself.
So anyone out there with their mysticism bingo cards handy, we've now talked about sex, food, and foreskin, so I guess we're done. So, obviously, then we have a male audience, but what is the breakdown of that audience? Is the text meant for everyone? Is this union something that everyone should be able to achieve? And what was the impetus behind this work? What was it supposed to be used for, and by whom?
Already in the 2nd century, there's a teaching in the Mishnah that proscribes the teaching of esoteric matters, of esoteric doctrines, to groups exceeding 2 or 3 people. And there becomes a history of esotericism, a history of the issue of to whom can esoteric matters be taught. And so on the one hand, there's a great deal of secrecy, and it would appear primarily oral transmission rather than written transmission of texts describing these doctrines. On the other hand, mystics tend to be very excited because they are having extraordinary experiences in their connections with God. And they want to tell people, right? You have an amazing experience, come off an amazing roller coaster, you want to tell people about it. And so they start to write in coded ways, and others just can't resist. They feel like, no, this is really too important. Perhaps revealing these things will bring about a messianic era. They'll bring about a transformation of humanity, a transformation of the cosmos. So the Zohar in particular emerges as a text that, if you know its code, then you can read it. Now, it's not like things are today where you can just click on buy this now and the book arrives at your doorstep a couple days later. Books then were written on parchments and they were very expensive. A few people owned them. And while Judaism emphasized literacy, it was literacy in order to do basic practices. There wasn't a professional rabbinate so much at that time, certainly not like there is today. So who would have been reading this text at the beginning? Other Kabbalists. In the 13th century, we're talking about a couple hundred people, right? We're talking about a very, very small group of people spread around Spain and Germany in particular. And yet, at the same time, we have these 1 or 2 page manuscripts where people have cheat sheets that tell them, here are the names of these 10 sphirot, of the 10 gradations of divinity. So what are those for? Those are not for an elite crew that are trained to be Kabbalists. This is stuff that guys are reading on their lunch breaks while they're earning $15 an hour at Amazon. And they're feeling like, oh, I'm now part of a special group that knows this stuff. So on the one hand, you've got a fairly difficult text that really needs a teacher. And on the other hand, a popularization of certain doctrines that's taking place where people are feeling like there's something really exciting going on.
There's something truly wonderful about taking a text that is so dense and combines so many different influences and authors and was refined until it became a critically important document, and that is turned into a Cliff Notes version for just anyone to read. But it does say something about how people could engage with mysticism. If they didn't have ecstatic experiences and experience these visions or auditions or engagements for themselves, they could still contemplate these ideas and develop some sort of connection of their own.
Yeah, you certainly have the same phenomenon today. I mean, you can you have people who invest years in meditation in different kinds of spiritual traditions in order to become spiritually enlightened. And you've got other people who will, smoke a joint and you get a high, and it's a kind of a shortcut. Now, the shortcut, I'm not sure is going to be quite as long lasting because you haven't integrated a spiritual orientation in the same way. And yet we're human beings. We're going to want shortcuts if we can get them.
I love that. Doing drugs is cheating. If you want to get high, meditate.
Yeah, well, we'll leave out personal biographies here, but I understand both tracks.
I mean, we all bring our own personal experiences into the things that we study, etc., etc. Anyway, as you mentioned, this is a very large text. Do you remember where you first came across it and what your first impression of it was?
The first time that I studied it was several years after the first exposure to Jewish mystical writing. It was in the fall of 1991. I was taking my second course in graduate school at New York University. And we started reading a famous part of the Zohar that deals with the esoteric exegesis of the book of Exodus, specifically chapter 21. Now, if you look at chapter 21, one would not normally think that that's going to be the place to find spirituality. It deals with the laws of slaves. When you let them free, how you let them free, what you have to provide for them, if you provide wives for male slaves. And yet the Zoharic Kabbalists look at this material and think the deepest secrets must be right here. And they discover through opening up the text that what it's actually talking about are the secrets of the human soul and the ways and the byways of the soul as it travels from the supernal Garden of Eden down into this world, and the fate that it may encounter if by some terrible cause, usually because the parents are doing something naughty, that the other side, that is the side of the demonic, intervenes and causes the scale of balance in the heavenly world to tip to the side of transgression. And then how that soul can be redeemed. And while obviously this is not the simple or plain sense of the text, it was very exciting for me because on the one hand, any traditional religion is trying to sustain the meaningfulness and the relevance of an archaic text. And yet it runs into this impediment that it may not be immediately susceptible to that kind of reading. And so the creativity that goes into this, the attentiveness to the spellings of particular words, to the ways in which particular words in scripture get interpreted by the rabbinical tradition, all of these are attended to and then exploited as ways to expose what the deeper and true meaning of what God was trying to communicate are revealed.
All of the parents out there, I'm sure that you caught that. Basically, parents have always gotten a bad rap. We've always been blamed for everything. Everything is your fault. No matter what you do, you're ruining your child's life. I'm very sorry.
Particularly moms, remember.
Of course. Such is the burden we bear. So I keep saying over and over how long this text is because it's truly shocking to me and makes me nervous to even contemplate. But out of all of that, is there a particular passage in the text that really resonates with you or that you find really fascinating?
Yeah, so this is a wonderful text that I'd like to share with you. It comes from the first volume. It's on folio 100A through 101A. And, well, I'll read it and then we can talk about it. Radiance, radiance of radiances, radiance and illumination. Radiance, shining and illuminating, sparkling on diverse sides. Radiance, rising and falling. Radiance, sparkling on every side. Radiance, gushing, flowing forth. Radiance, never ceasing. Radiance, issuing progeny. Radiance, hidden and concealed, gleam of all shimmers and lamps. Everything within it, gushing and hidden, concealed and revealed, seen and unseen. Edge of an axe, wellspring, gushing during the day, veiled at night, delighting at midnight in the offspring it has issued, radiance radiating and shining for all entirety of the Torah. This is what is seen, all colors concealed within it, called by the name Adonai. Three colors visible below from three colors above. From these supernal ones, all celestial ones emanate. Radiance unseen, sparkling in 12 sparks and gleams glimmering from it. 13 in the mystery of the holy name. Within the mystery of Ein Sof, infinite one, she is called Yud, He, Vav, He. When lower radiance, Adonai, bonds with upper radiance, Yud, He, Vav, and He, a hidden name is formed through which true prophets know and gaze into upper radiance. Vision of hidden ones, as is written, like the color of amber from within the fire, Ezekiel 1:4. There's much more to read, but, there are time limits to these things.
Okay, so lots of radiance, makes children, and then there's an axe.
Yeah, so radiance is the translation for the word Zohar. So in other words, in the original Aramaic text, it reads Zohar, radiance of radiances, or Zohar, Zohar of Zohars, Zohar shining and illuminating, etc. And this is clearly a meditative text. It might have been chanted by readers, and it's clearly a visionary text. It is one in which one is seeing various kinds of glimmers and gleams and sparkles as one is either reading it or contemplating it. And you're right, this reference to issuing progeny, it goes back to part of what we were talking about earlier about one of the things that distinguishes Jewish mysticism is this commitment to procreation as a commandment, but it sees that as something that is taking place in an ethereal way, in the way in which God's own self creates the world. That which comes of God is God's offspring, is that we are God's children, but that even before we get to humanity, that there are aspects of divinity itself that are progeny of higher aspects of God's self. So in the same way that Christianity will talk about the Father and the Son, so you get similar familial elements taking place within Jewish mysticism. And then there's the edge of an axe, and there's a wellspring. So on the one hand, you get something that is a flow, and you get something that cuts it off. These are mixed metaphors, of course, right? An axe can't stop the water from flowing. And the Zohar delights in combining metaphors that don't naturally coexist with each other. And that's part of the literary charm and what's provocative about it. But what that tension is about is, we can go back to parenting for a moment, is that if you have a household in which there is only love and there is only giving, then what happens is the kids get spoiled. And if you have a household in which the kids are always being disciplined and always being yelled at and always being told what the rules are, they grow up fearful and angry. And so what we strive for is to have some kind of balance, hopefully with love dominating, but with there being both giving and discipline and a sense of there being joy and rules. But perhaps a different, metaphor to think about is if you're designing a town, you have to have stoplights, and you have to have stoplights that are sometimes green and sometimes red. Because if they're always green, what's going to happen is you're going to have car crashes everywhere. And if they're always red, nothing happens. And so that's why we have this gushing of the wellspring on the one hand, the green lights, and while we have an edge of an axe that says, no, you have to stop. Both of those are required for an effective functioning of cities and of God.
It's very poetic, and I like the idea of it being a meditative, chanting text, because there is an element of radiance being repeated so many times that it almost seems to lose meaning. Like when someone says the word spoon over and over again, all of a sudden you start thinking that doesn't really sound like a word. Where did that even come from? What does that mean? But because radiance means so many things and can be interpreted in so many ways, it seems to keep itself together a little bit more. So rather than it becoming a nonsense word, instead it feels like it's being opened up to all of these different meanings, allowing for greater exploration of what it means.
Yes, I think that's true. And part of the power of the Zohar is that it draws on all of the images and all of the metaphors of Scripture. Scripture itself is vast, but because Scripture is conceptualized as contained within the covers of a book, there's a certain kind of unity that is understood to exist. And all of that gets consolidated within this more compact rubric of 10 gradations of divinity, of the deity, and ultimately within the infinite one, the Ein Sof, which is utterly unknowable. So that there's a kind of a telescoping that takes place as the Kabbalists envision divinity emerging from a point that is utterly unknowable to first a point, and then into a line, and then into three dimensions, and then into the world itself. And so much in the same way that human beings develop from a microscopic fertilized ovum, and then we become the complex creatures that we are, divinity is imagined in somewhat the same way, expanding into the complexity that we see in scripture and in the Talmudic and Midrashic traditions.
I mean, obviously, it took them 100 years. They came up with a good title. And I think the idea of radiance goes really well with that, because there's almost something ineffable about radiance as a term. It feels undefinable, but you also know what it means. The idea that something is radiant, I mean, you understand that that means it's shining or glowing, but what does that mean if you try to conceptualize it? It's really hard to do without using that specific word. So it really brings off that ineffable, uncontainable aspect in a really poetic and quite pretty way.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Is that the luminosity, as you know, is a central feature of most mystical traditions. Is part of why, going back to the heyday of the 50s and 60s when mysticism scholars were all kumbaya and thought, well, basically all mystics are having the same tradition. And they're just interpreting it with the symbols and images of their own traditions. That may have been something of an overstatement. And yet at the same time, there is something universal about luminosity, is that we see light. And I mean, it makes us smile in the summer in the way that seasonal affective disorder robs us of it in darker parts of the year. And, Maimonides, in the introduction to his great philosophical work, The Guide of the Perplexed, talks about how every individual has glimpses of insight, and he uses the word a flash, the same way that like lightning will illuminate a dark night, but that there are some people for whom the lightning just keeps on flashing and it never stops. And it is those people who are experiencing divinity in the deepest way. And the word experience is perhaps very important, that unlike in the philosophical tradition, where it's about understanding, clear-eyed cognizing of what certain doctrines and principles are about, mysticism emphasizes the experiential, sometimes in the mind, sometimes in the heart, sometimes the whole body. And it's not by accident that sexual climax is used in so many of these mystical texts because of the depth of its physical experience. And they use it as a metaphor for describing union, for a sense of loss of self that one doesn't have when one's just reading Aristotle or some such thing.
I mean, speak for yourself.
Well, I don't want to rob you of the pleasures of Aristotle, so you go for it.
You couldn't if you tried. How dare you even imply it? Okay, and on that note, we are unfortunately coming towards the end of our time, which means I have to ask you the final question, modified slightly, of course. So why did you decide to talk about the Zohar today? What is it that makes this text so special to you?
It goes back to a point that you raised a few minutes ago, and that is that what this text does is that it disrupts a clean, simple understanding of what God is about. I think that for me, part of what was so exciting about beginning and continuing to study mysticism is that it doesn't fall for the staid, parochial, conventional, and dare I say it, bourgeois manifestations of divinity. It keeps on challenging us to say, no, you don't understand. It's something else. No, it's not that metaphor. It's this metaphor. Oh, it's not the gushing flow. It's the edge of an axe. And what it keeps on doing is it keeps on saying, no, it's something else. It's something else. And it's the experience, that you might get in music videos today or in some films where it just keeps on flashing different images in front of you as a way of giving you an experience that defies rational understanding. And yet, if you slow it down, you can put the pieces together to a certain extent. And so I think that it's the flow of images and again, to use the same word, the disruption of rational discourse that's exciting for me about this particular passage and about so much of the Zohar in general.
Sounds like a very rock and roll kind of text.
Yeah, no doubt.
On that note, Joel, thank you so much for joining me today and for telling me all about the Zohar.
It was a pleasure, AJ. It was a lot of fun to talk with you this morning. And I look forward to hearing the text go live.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at MyFaveMystic and join me next time when I speak to Sean Field about Margarita Colonna.